Fox News Alert, we're waiting to hear from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who will brief the press after the much-anticipated meeting between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin that he's also attending. This is Outnumbered. I'm Meghan McCain, here today, the host of Kennedy on Fox Business, Kennedy herself. Also from FBN, the co-host of After the Bell, Melissa Francis, former national security staffer under Presidents Bush and Obama, Jillian Turner, and today's hashtag One Lucky Guy, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran and Fox News contributor Pete Hegseth, and you're outnumbered.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Get you off the weekends on here.
Into the weekdays and back to the weekends.
Yes.
That's right. My schedule's all off kilter.
Well, let's jump right into this because there's a lot of news to cover. As we await that press briefing, President Trump is holding his first sit-down with his Russian counterpart on the sidelines of the G20 summit. So many topics that could be on the agenda, from Syria to ISIS, the Ukraine, and North Korea, and perhaps Russia's interference in the U.S. election. Earlier today, President Trump was hopeful he and Vladimir Putin can find common ground.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well. We've had some very, very good talks. We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned. And it's an honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is traveling with the president and joins us live from Hamburg. Hi, John.
Megan, good afternoon to you. Good evening, actually, now from Hamburg, where it's just after the 6 o'clock hour. The fact that this bilateral meeting is still going on, I think, is relatively significant. This was originally planned more as just a sort of an elaborate pull-aside that might last a few minutes. But the two leaders have been in there talking now for more than an hour in what appears to be a very intimate setting. It's just the President of the United States, the President of Russia, and their Secretary of State or Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov and Rex Tillerson. And when you get into a situation like this, where there's only the two leaders and their chief deputies in the diplomatic front talking, you can actually get some things done. You mentioned that there are a lot of issues between the two leaders in the two countries that need to be talked about, and some of them that need to be resolved, and some elephants in the room that need to be aired as well. And I don't know how much of that they're getting into, particularly this idea of Russia's alleged interference in the U.S. election, but certainly on issues like Syria and North Korea, Crimea, the Ukraine, and Bashar al-Assad in Syria, there is a lot that they have to talk about. The president sounded an optimistic note, as you played there just a short time ago. Vladimir Putin sounding an optimistic note as well through a translator, and the audio wasn't very good because the still photographers were snapping so loudly that you couldn't really hear him speak. But his translator said, quote, "Your Excellency, Mr. President, we spoke over the phone with you several times before on very important bilateral and international issues. While phone conversation is never enough, if we want to have a positive development through bilaterals and be able to resolve most acute international problems, definitely need to have personal meetings. I'm delighted to be able to meet you personally, Mr. President, and I hope, as you have said, our meeting will yield positive results." It is possible, Megan, that we could have some agreement on a couple of issues, in particular, maybe a greater cooperation between the U.S. and the Russian military on these issues of deconfliction and the operating theater over Syria, perhaps a new resolution to work together to defeat ISIS, and maybe something on North Korea in terms of adhering to United Nations Security Council resolutions. But those thorny issues of Crimea and the Ukraine will likely go unresolved. And if the president doesn't come out of this meeting and his Secretary of State and press secretary are not able to say that the president did raise the issue of Russia's meddling in the election, that is going to give the president's critics a lot of ammunition to go after him on. So that's one of the things that we're really, really waiting for. You hear a bang going on just below me here. There's a lot of fireworks that are going off here as the protesters have now finished work or whatever it is they were doing for the day and taking to the streets here of Hamburg. Short time ago, outside a hotel, riot police and a couple of water cannons pulled up. Those water cannons are now deployed out in the streets, and they're dealing with the protesters. Last evening, there was a substantial amount of violence as a lot of these protesters, specifically members of what are called the Black Bloc, and I don't know that this is actually an organized protest group as much as it is this residents of Hamburg or people who come from elsewhere across Europe. dress up in black and mix it up with the police take to the streets. But we're expecting that as we get into Friday night here on the very first actual day of the summit, that there will be a lot of what's going on in the streets that we saw last night as well. So we'll keep a close eye on it for you all here, Megan, and report back on it as the afternoon progresses there in the United States and as we get into the evening here in Germany.
John Roberts, this is Melissa Francis. I wanted to ask you a quick question. I mean, everybody wants to know about the conversation that's going on in that room. Can you tell us again in terms of who's in the room? What will we learn? What will we know? Obviously, there's a lot that we shouldn't because these are their conversations and negotiations, but we want to know. What are we going to know?
Well, clearly there will be the statements that come out from the Russian side and the American side, and it'll be interesting to compare and contrast those. We're expecting the Russian statement will go up fairly quickly on their website. The official U.S. statement may take a little bit longer because the White House press office does tend to run a little bit behind. But the fact that we're getting this briefing, we hear some firecrackers going off in the background, the fact that we're getting this briefing by administration officials will mean that they'll have to be a little more frank about what was talked about in this meeting. They'll be taking questions as well. You know, the bilateral meeting, for example, between the president and Enrique Peña Nieto of Mexico was about a paragraph long, didn't really say too much. But the fact that we're being briefed on this by administration officials, Melissa, will mean we'll get a greater level of detail, a greater level of granularity over what happened. And there will be some pointed questions toward the administration officials who are briefing as to exactly what they talked about, and in particular, whether or not this issue of Russia's meddling in the election came up. A question was shouted by the media pool to President Trump just before they began the bilateral meeting as to whether or not he would raise that issue. He ignored the question, and the press was ushered out of the room. But they'll have to go into some level of detail about that in this briefing coming up, Melissa.
Absolutely. John Roberts, thank you so much. And we want to let our audience know that we are going to be standing by for that briefing. It is audio only, and we're going to bring it to you out there in the audience just as soon as we can. Megan.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, like you just said, is sitting on pins and needles, anticipating what exactly has gone on in that meeting. Let's remember, Pete, that just yesterday, President Trump was very critical of Russia, saying they destabilized activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, and its support for hostile regimes, including Syria and Iran. So he had been quite, critical of Russia and President Vladimir Putin yesterday in Poland. So it'll be interesting to see if anything regarding Syria or the Ukraine comes up.
It's only interesting because it doesn't fit the narrative of the so-called mainstream media. I mean, count me as one who's not on pins and needles, because I think this is has been stoked from the beginning as a conspiracy. I mean, I'm surprised that the meeting was originally scheduled for only 30 minutes. I mean, don't you need longer if you're going to finish all the collusion you've been doing for the last 6 to 8 months? I mean, don't you need more time to figure out all the things you're...
Yeah, you got a lot of details to
now
work
that
on
you
going
have this
forward.
moment where no one else can traffic in your conversations. I mean, this is an important conversation because real things are happening in the world. Yeah. This administration was serious from the beginning about finding a new partnership with Vladimir Putin. I mean, Vladimir Putin's playing a weak hand. We have a strong hand. The problem is Barack Obama lost to a weak hand because he didn't know how to play poker. Now Vladimir Putin's looking into the camera against a real poker player who's standing up for America. That changes the dynamic completely. And I think we could get some important concessions, which we would never get before because we looked weak. So I'm interested to see what comes out of it. But ultimately, I know that President Trump's in there pursuing American interests.
What do concessions look like? I guess that's what I'm most curious about. What will Russia give to us? What hand will they show? And it's interesting because a lot of people want Russia to change. And there are a lot of people in this country who've been very dubious of Vladimir Putin and Russia for a long time. And, this president is hopeful, he's optimistic, as every new president is when they come in and they meet him for the first time. But they have so much ground to cover. Megan, you pointed out they've been in there for over an hour. And they've got to talk about ISIS. They have to talk about Syria. They've got to talk about North Korea and this UN resolution. Where do they start? Where do they finish? And what does a victory for the U.S. look like?
Not to mention Ukraine and elsewhere. I mean, places where we still have very strategic interests that are not aligned with theirs. I mean, Putin is steely-eyed in pursuing Russia's best interests. President Trump wants to pursue America's best interests. They diverge in so many different places. The few places where they do, like Syria and elsewhere, killing ISIS, they don't because propping up the Assad regime. And frankly, Iran, Russia, and Assad
the
is at the terms of that issue.
The Iran issue is the most complicating of all, isn't it, Jillian?
To a degree, yes. I think the key things to look for in this meeting outside of the collusion story is Russia's very real attempted meddling in some of our election infrastructure as apart and separate from, Pete brought up the collusion. That's a separate investigation. There's an entire investigation in the Congress going on right now into what exactly they tried to do in terms of the general election. That will come up, I'm sure. There's also the matter of, I think in Ukraine, the president was saying yesterday that they have tried to destabilize Ukraine. It goes much further than that. This is the Russian regime illegally invaded Ukraine and has been illegally occupying that country now for 3.5 years. That will come up. I don't know what concessions are going to look like there because the Putin regime does not seem willing to give an inch on that issue. We're on opposite sides of the Syrian civil war, as you mentioned, Kennedy, and then there's also NATO expansion, something that Russia is doing everything in its power to tamp down. Those are going to be the substantive focus of the meeting. I doubt the collusion will even come up, to be honest. I can't imagine President Trump is going to bring it up.
I disagree with you. I disagree. I think he's going to bring up the idea of the meddling. I think he's going to say it for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if it's almost, we know you did this type thing and in passing so that it's out there. But you know exactly what Putin's response is going to be. I mean, even when you come down to, he's always sort of denying and deflecting at every turn. When you look at some of the things that he's even said about North Korea, saying, well, we have there's no confirmation that that was an ICBM. Yeah. I mean, that's a ridiculous statement. And that's how he addresses all of these things, by just this denial of the evidence that's out there.
They also did the same thing, to your point, in the Syrian chemical attack.
Yes, exactly.
But
exactly. We don't know this happened.
And then they said, no, this is obviously Russia was apologizing.
But I think we should look back on history, as you noted, Kennedy, and every president for many, many administrations, but I would bring up Bush saying he looked into Putin's eyes and saw a soul. We had President Obama saying he would have more flexibility after the election to work with Russia. It is always a complete and utter pipe dream. So while I do believe that President Trump is a great deal maker and he's been a great president thus far, I think the idea that we can find any levity or any compromise whatsoever is absolutely ridiculous, because I would start with, hey, can you stop aiding and abetting Assad and the greatest, chemical gassing of people since World War II? That would be the first thing I bring up. And I think the idea that we can somehow be hopeful coming out of this that we're going to be in alliance with one another, Putin is 100%. I think
it's a complete fallacy. Yeah. This idea that somehow if we only had a manly man in power in the United States who could stand up to Putin, that is a complete fallacy. There is a reason why every administration, from George W. Bush through President Obama through now President Trump, has ultimately been frustrated with this regime.
That's different from what Megan said. That's the opposite.
They're not willing to negotiate.
Absent the fact that they're propping up Bashar al-Assad, so they're totally invested, and they've got interest there. You set that aside, they still have problem with radical Islamists. There's still a place where, in a world that looks different than Syria, we could collaborate with them to take on the threat that they deal with inside their borders at some level too, even though they like to conflate it all the time against to name any opposition that they face. What I like is that President Trump's undeterred or not concerned about the optics. Does it go 30 minutes or an hour and a half? Yeah. He wants to have a candid conversation, an honest conversation, and you actually can get things done when you have two people who are not lying to themselves. They may be lying to everybody else. In Vladimir Putin's case, he's denying everything, but he's pursuing Russian interests. We know what he wants to do. He wants to expand the orbit of influence and advance greater Russia. We know that we can play off that.
I want to ask you something really quick, because this is something you've been very passionate about: leaks. Does it seem like they're going to put a cap on this by having fewer people in the room? And do you think we'll have fewer leaks from this conversation?
I mean, I'm sure they're certainly going to try. I think that's why so few people are allowed in that room. That being said, I fully expect Russia to come out with a nice piece of propaganda, and I probably expect Rex Tillerson to come and spin, even if it's true or not, that President Trump did a great job and everything's amazing. So I think depending on which figure that comes out of that room, they will spin which agenda they want. I think going into this, I agree with you. I actually like that he doesn't care about optics on this as well. I like that he's gone over an hour and he can completely, they can meet for 5 hours as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
But I do think the left is looking for ammo on this. And if even there was a picture of them sort of like shaking hands and then Putin sitting in the side and Trump sort of leaning over. I saw people attacking that already. So I think no matter what happens and comes out of this meeting, I think Democrats will pounce all over
and who
it.
cares? I mean, they can do whatever they want. They can pounce on it. It has no impact on the substance. I think you guys are making really different points, though. I mean, Megan, I agree with you. I don't think that there's any way for them to come out and be buddies and work together and kumbaya. I think that's the face you put on when you walk in the room or when you start something. It was the same thing with China. Look, we're going to sit down. We're going to make a deal. It makes it look like you're willing to come to the table and say something. I don't hold that fantasy at all. I disagree with you, though, this idea. I mean, I do think that President Obama put on an angry face when he met him, and it was ludicrous. There was nothing behind that. There was no muscle. And I do think that no matter what face President Trump goes in with, he's not to be screwed with.
And
you know, that
President
he's
Trump already
sent
came out.
Tomahawk
He also
missiles.
he has an unpredictability. You're right.
That's
it plays very differently.
That's fantastic.
We should point
with
out that
Russia
President Obama
specifically
told
than any
him to
other
cut it
administration.
out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's really aggressive, tough
exactly.
language to go against him. I 100% agree with you. I think he can't not take this meeting. I know there are people that saying it maybe shouldn't happen to begin with. I think it would have looked even more weak.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a shred of evidence about Russian collusion ever, but let alone for the last, not even leaks leading to misleading headlines for the last couple of weeks and months. So this is exactly what he should be doing, exactly the right time to do it. Forget about the optics. Pursue shared interest, even if there's a shred of it that exists, and let the critics hate, because they're gonna come after him no matter what. And he almost trolls them. He knows how to troll them. And that's exactly what he's
But it's interesting because Putin does the same thing. So in that sense, they're trolling each other. Does it neutralize the dynamic if they're both coming at it through psychological manipulation?
Possibly, but at least we know who they are and what they represent. And it's not, I'm going to be tough on Vladimir Putin, but Barack Obama's going to be soft when it comes down to it.
Listen, again, I will say destabilizing activities in Ukraine and elsewhere for hostile regimes, much tougher language than Obama ever said in his entire 8 years.
You could argue not tough enough, which I would. When you talk about, again, an
I will take
illegal
anything over than
incursion
cut it
into a
out.
country.
You worked with the Obama administration. I'm sorry. Cut it out is ridiculous. It's what you say to a dog when it's peeing on the rug, not what you say to a dictator when it's helping to chemically gas people in Syria. I mean, it's absurd.
Well, look, I think the one thing here, the good news going into this is that with less people on the U.S. side, you can try and control, as you guys were saying, the leaks coming out on the American side. There is no accountability on the Russian side. And we cannot predict the multitude of ways in which they're going to try and manipulate the outcome of this on the optic side, on the tail end of that meeting. So that'll be interesting. Everything that leaks out of this is not necessarily coming from the United States.
I want to keep
that in mind.
And I want to make one more point before we move away from this. I mean, when he talks about energy, and yesterday when he talked about Poland wouldn't be held hostage to a single supplier of energy, President Trump's energy policy is a direct threat to Russia. I mean, we are driving down the price of energy, which is the only thing that Russia has going.
Well, one of his,
and that's
what's driving them in the Middle East.
One of his primary goals in going one of his primary goals in going to Warsaw in the first place, before attending the G20 summit, was to formally endorse a project known as the 3 Cs Initiative, which is something that the U.S. private sector and the think tank policy community in D.C. has been working on for a few years now, which reroutes the power grid. Instead of everything running from Russia, running east to west, now actually goes north to south. It's something to hedge against the Russian control of energy in the sphere. It's a really smart thing that the president is signed on to now. Going forward, I think he needs to do more with these other foreign leaders of really trumpeting that, because that's the best hope right now of hedging against Russia.
All right, we are going to keep our eyes on this meeting between President Trump and Putin, which has gone on much longer than scheduled time. After that, Rex Tillerson, who was in the meeting, will brief reporters along with Sean Spicer. We'll bring you that. Meantime, we're awaiting new reaction from Democratic lawmakers after President Trump's meeting with Mr. Putin. But some top Democrats were already slamming the president before the high-stakes sit-down. Are they going too far? And is it appropriate for lawmakers to criticize the president while he's overseas? We'll be right back.
So right now, Presidents Trump and Putin still meeting. They were initially set to talk for about 30 minutes, and they have been together for more than an hour now. When they wrap up, we're going to hear from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who is in that meeting. In the meantime, we are waiting a reaction from Democratic lawmakers to that high-stakes sit-down. Even before it began, many Democrats were ready to pounce and were extremely critical of the president. Big surprise. Here's Senate Minority Whip Dick Durbin comparing Putin Putin to Mr. Trump. Watch.
Senator, what's the most positive thing you have to say about Vladimir Putin and the most negative?
Well, the most positive thing is he is gifted in his knowledge of history. Our president is not. He certainly knows how to meet with foreign leaders and to push his agenda. Our president has limited experience in that. In terms of his weakness, he too suffers from a form of megalomania.
Oh, good Lord.
It's so gracious.
So supportive.
Pop psychology at its finest.
I mean, please, Jillian, I don't even know what to make of that.
I don't know. Whenever any analysts, start talking about the psychology that goes behind, world leaders meeting, and it's a little bit silly, right? I mean, there's no serious way to really frame this under the guise of, like I said, pop psychology. It just doesn't work. You can talk policy, you can talk objectives, but leave people's personalities.
And one of them knows history, the other one's, but they're both megalomaniacs.
That's the same reason I was saying earlier, it doesn't really, the argument doesn't fly with me that, oh, President Trump is somehow more manly than President Obama and he's going to stand up to Putin. It's kind of a worthless argument.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's completely worthless.
Dick Durbin.
Feel free to extrapolate on that, Kennedy.
Yes.
I don't know. I think it's a completely different dynamic, and I think President Obama's foreign policy had no teeth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different argument.
Yeah, but
that's different.
And
I don't know. Manly enough.
I don't know if there are feats of manliness that can be proven. I don't know if they can flip over tractors or something like that.
Has that ever been tried?
Their worth and skill. Maybe this is the modern presidency.
Maybe we should settle things.
Maybe something. But what I will say is, I think Dick Durbin is being a little bit foolish, because if we're talking about the United States and the agenda of this country in an international context, then don't you want the United States to do better than everybody else as an American? And Russians love chaos. They absolutely love that these both parties are cannibalizing each other, because it allows them to fly under the radar, and they are not held accountable, and no one's talking about NATO.
It's a great point. The most effective arm of Russian propaganda has been the Democratic Party and the left-wing media in this country, which has pushed that collusion narrative now since the election and before it. Dick Durbin is a hack. Dick Durbin is a political hack. You have to consider the source on this. I guarantee if we rolled tape of 8 years ago when Barack Obama was on his apology tour, they would be lauding him for his new sophisticated globalist internationalist approach. And then, or when they gave him the Peace Prize, what a joke that was. The world's aflame with millions dead as a result of policies that he never enforced because of a weak-kneed view of the world. And he gets a Peace Prize. So we forget how bad it was 8 years ago and how much this president was fawned upon by the people who are now turning on President Trump because he takes a different perspective that the American people elected him to take.
Yeah, plus here's what Dick Durbin has to say.
Well, I don't think many people do, which is why he's not terribly relevant politician right now. I agree with you. He's a complete and total hack. I think the politics of this are always very interesting. For those of us who have cared about Russia for a very long time, it's interesting to see Democrats actually care all of a sudden, because let me tell you, we had a president for the last 8 years say he didn't care about Putin and his expansion into Crimea and the Ukraine is laughable. And then, by the way, nuclearize the Middle East with the Iran deal. So to say that Democrats care, the only time they care is they don't care about, well, I'm just, when you're talking about foreign policy globally, I do think it's not about masculinity, as you're saying, but it is about being tough and putting the precedents that America is now first, and the apology tour of Obama is not only long gone, but we are actually going to completely undo the legacy of the last 8 years. And I think going forward, it's very difficult for me to take liberals and people on the left seriously in anything regarding Russia, because they only cared when they manifested that it impacted their election.
It's also interesting.
What do you think, though, about the president's comments in Warsaw about the press? Because I heard a lot coming from the left, a lot of criticism. The president shouldn't really criticize the American press.
As long as he's not arming the Middle East, I do not care what he says about the press overseas.
Are the press diplomats? Are the press official arms of our government? I mean, he's not going around criticizing other politicians. He's talking about a press that misportrays what he does every single day. That's going to obsess over a handshake as opposed to real things that he did. And to your point, I think the most strong it matters to be the strongest tribe in this world.
Can I just say, do you know what I care about? This is what I care about. Obama apologized to France. America's shown arrogance. 2009. Apologized to the Muslim world. We have not been perfect. Apologized to the Summit of the Americas. At times we sought to dictate our own terms. Went on and on and on. This apology tour, I have a million quotes here, are darker periods in history apologizing to the Turkish parliament. So I don't really care what President Trump says about the media overseas, as long as he's not talking about America showing arrogance.
Yeah, poor media.
But you know, I think to that point that Pete made, I think there is something to be said, and this is why people get so sick of the hypocrisy in Washington, because using terms like weakness to categorize one president when you would never level the same kind of criticism at the president from your party, it rings so hollow.
Absolutely. Against real weakness, you don't even talk about it at all.
And it's interesting to hear Dick Durbin talk about how President Trump has, doesn't know anything about history, and President Putin does, right on the heels of what was really a tremendous speech yesterday in Poland that was so historically set. I mean, he did talk about major issues there, and the whole setting, the way that he framed it in terms of what had come before him, it was really historic. So to pick on that in particular is
It's also deeply outrageous to make the comparison that somehow Putin and Trump are in the same level of megalomania. I don't agree that Trump is a megalomaniac, number one, but the idea that you can somehow compare someone who murders people in the shadows of the Kremlin and jails journalists and women who speak out and dissidents. I mean, the idea that you can in any way compare what's happening in Russia to the United States is also, by the way, why the left has gotten so hysterical with President Trump that any argument they're making completely flies out the window.
On Melissa's point, I feel like that so far this trip, especially the Poland portion that came first, was like, this has been the presidency that I would think candidate Donald Trump would have sort of dreamed about. You know, he makes a stop in an Eastern European nation that the United States helped to rebuild after World War I, that we then later, we helped in the, overcome the communist rule there. He has this warm reception because there's two conservative parties in power, and he's able to connect with them on a political level as well. He has this warm reception from the Polish public. In a lot of ways, it's been like a dream tour. This should have been his first. Supporters of the president's party, I'm sure, wish this was like his first overseas tour rather than the first European game.
That's why the press said nothing about it. He went to Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Vatican. The press was largely silent about how reorienting that tour, that trip was in the Middle East. It reshifted the geopolitics of that entire region. So they've underplayed.
Okay, but to that point, why does this president do so well overseas on these foreign trips, and why does some of that fall apart back home? Because it seems like he has clarity of message, and he's got a purpose and a way of reaching out that you don't see on display so much in the United States.
No,
he's stopped tweeting.
No, he doesn't have the international plan. He doesn't have international data.
But
so it's like he's not tweeting. It is expensive.
Well, he's always much more disciplined with his social media when he's abroad, because he is staying on message with what he's saying, obviously in Poland and overseas. And I think he always sort of goes away from his narrative, and we start focusing on dumb things like cable news host plastic surgery, which is I have absolutely no interest in whatsoever. So I think social media is actually a big part of it. And he's doing
he did one of the tweets he tweeted, I think it was this morning, in advance of the G20. Aside from John Pitt, I felt like that was a waste of his time on this day. But I felt like a good thing that he tweeted today was that he's going to make America proud. You know, he was like, I'm going to go into these meetings, I'm looking forward to these meetings, and I'm going to represent the United States. And I think that was well received. The reason I don't like the John Podesta email is because he tweeted something, I don't have the quote, but, everybody here in Europe is talking about John Podesta's hand. It's like,
once again, trolling the press.
Really? That's what everybody's talking about? I doubt it. But if you want to say that.
They follow the shining object like the lemmings that they are, and then he has the conversation he wants to. No, the press are ridiculous. They are. But I would say that the reason we have a knee-jerk reaction to Dick Durbin's comments is because politics used to stop at the water's edge. And right now, Democrats in this country are voting, they're cheering against this president, and they've become so far left, they relate more to European liberals who want an open welfare state.
I thought we were going to have a truce.
Middle America. So I don't see that truce happening.
In the shadow of that horrific shooting and that attempted murder. I thought we were going to have a political truce, which apparently is now over.
You know, Newt Gingrich was right. We were on the couch with him that day the day of the shooting, and he said this will last about 48 hours, and I think it didn't even last that long.
We want to let people know that the meeting between the presidents, between President Trump and President Putin, has now ended. We are going to be right back, and we will have details of that, and we're expecting a press briefing as well. It's going to be audio only. We're going to bring you all of that when we come back.
Well, there you have it. The meeting is over. 2 hours plus for the presidents of the United States and Russia. We still have no word on exactly the conversations that took place and the topics that the two strong men covered. But we certainly can speculate on what might have happened and what we are going to hear from our own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, when he debriefs an entire nation that is waiting with bated breath. Pete?
I am too. I mean, I imagine what happened is you, like I said before, you get into the room, it's so much collusion, so little time. How do we knock it all out? You know,
well, they already have to start planning 2020.
Maybe they've just spent the whole time colluding.
There you go.
2.5 hours.
Based on what the press will be saying, I'm sure that'll be the whole narrative.
Maybe he finally found those yoga emails.
They can just come out and Secretary Tillerson can just say, we are now more colluded than ever. Thank you, everyone. You can go home.
Yep.
How much would you like to be in that room, though? I mean,
I would pay an obscene amount of money.
I really would. I'm so fascinated. I would pay an obscene amount of money to be in that room.
But let me ask you this, because it seems as though there has been a shift, a change in policy toward Russia, and maybe it's been recent. The Secretary of State, you know, he was accused, certainly during his confirmation hearings, of being an apologist for Russia and too cozy with the Kremlin. But then we see our UN ambassador Nikki Haley. He certainly did, and that is nothing to sneeze at. It's very official. Nikki Haley has been very tough on Russia and some of the president's own statements in Poland. What do you make of that? Do you see more of a shift and a tougher stance?
I don't know that it matters what anyone says. I mean, that's what I always get, like, whether they're making a speech or however they talk about how they're going to talk. And I mean, I just take from the fact that President Putin is he basically comes out and obfuscates and lies about what's going on. I mean, when he says that there's no proof that North Korean missile was an ICBM, you know, it's like, who cares what anyone says? It only matters what they do. And I think that they know that President Trump is going to do a whole heck of a lot more. And we saw that right out of the gate with those Tomahawk missiles. And no matter how much President Obama said, knock it off, you know, even if he said, we're going to bomb you tomorrow, you wouldn't believe him because he drew a red line.
It doesn't matter what people say, but it does matter what the president says. And what he says, to my mind, in my view of the world, his tone on Russia has grown from, like, if you look back to maybe a year and a half ago to now, over the course of the campaign to now, he's become much more hardline on Russia. And I think that's the result of, him learning more from he went from working with Vladimir Putin as a sort of private sector entity, which is very different than working with him as a counterpart, as a foreign head of state. When you have all the things at stake that President Trump does now, you inevitably are going to change your perspective on somebody, and I think that's what's reflected here. His own rhetoric has changed a lot.
Although to make a good point, though,
we want it to.
Even when you're dealing with him on business, you know he kills people. So it's like, I mean, that just impacts.
Boris Nemtsov, Google it. Boris Nemtsov, Google it. It's a famous story. But I will say, going forward, I also think it's General Mattis and McMaster and their influence in his administration. They're absolutely brilliant general warriors. I would say the General Patton of our time. I think their influence on him when it comes to diplomacy and when it comes to our relationship with Russia clearly has an effect. Let's not forget that the reason those Tomahawk missiles were sent was because of Ivanka Trump, because she saw a bunch of pictures someplace of a bunch of children being gassed and went to her father and said, you can't let this stand. So I also think we can't underestimate his family's influence in regard to this.
But it's also interesting because, you know, to your point, Jillian, and some of the people who've come into the administration with different experiences as private entities with Russia, you know, I think of Rex Tillerson, and he speaks the language that Vladimir Putin knows best, and that's energy. And obviously, like, his tone, you know, Secretary Tillerson's tone has changed. So, and maybe we'll see if they're going in there with something other than optimism, Pete, if they're going in there with a more realistic view view of Russia. Is there a chance that today's meeting and the fact that it went on about 3 times longer than we thought it was going to, is there a chance this lays a foundation for something substantial in the future? And what is that?
Potentially lays the foundation for something substantial in the future. It could be a trade. I mean, this is a guy who might say, listen, we understand how significant that is. You understand how significant this is. We want both. We both can't have both. So I'm going to give one and you're going to get another. We can't quite know exactly what that would be, whether that would be borders in Eastern Europe or something in the Middle East or missiles, or, missile defense systems, whatever it is.
But
There's a lot of things.
Do you really think President Putin has, is capable of making a concession? I don't believe that type of diplomacy with the United States is really, no matter who the U.S. president is. I think this is how every U.S. president over the last 25 years has approached the relationship with Russia and ultimately come out on,
So he looked at it from the outside as a candidate, saying, maybe there's something we can work on. And to your point, then a lot of experts sat down, looked at interest, and said, you know what? No, the reasons we did things for so long happened for a reason, because we were responding to communists and now a strongman in Vladimir Putin. We need to take a harder stance. He should get credit from, again, the media on that, because why do they want his tax returns? Because they assume he's going to pursue personal financial interests in Russia, right? No, he's president of the United States. He loves his country, and he's there to make sure he advances our interests. Where's the story about that? Oh, here's a guy whose views have changed, or he has learned more and is taking a stronger stance. Because I agree. I think he's taken a much stronger stance.
But again, maybe they just want transparency.
He's revealed who Vladimir Putin really is.
Maybe the people who want to see the tax returns,
or maybe they just
want some transparency.
Or maybe they just
Is that such a terrible thing?
But I also think that I don't understand the idea and rationale when we have a president, and I said that quote numerous times, being so hard against Russia, so hard against their relationship with Syria and Crimea up to this point, saying everything I had always hoped President Obama said, and all of a sudden you think he's not being hard enough? I just don't understand this shift right now with people on the left. You did not care. You could not have cared less. I could not get people in the media to talk about this when it was happening for the last 8 years, and all of a sudden Trump's not being harsh enough? Give me a break.
All right, well, we will not give you a break. We will continue with this and the passionate outcome of this meeting between two superpowers. We'll bring you its contents as they are revealed. Stay with us.
So that meeting between President Trump and President Putin going on for longer than 2 hours, it has now broken up, and we are awaiting some arrivals going on at this G20 meeting. You can see world leaders beginning to file in there. They're going to get together for one big giant photo. We will bring you all of that as it happens. In the meantime, I mean, one of the subjects we haven't been talking about quite as much right now is the situation in North Korea. And Jillian, what impact could they have, this group together? What could they achieve on a situation that is boiling over, to say the least?
Well, it's very difficult to, as 3 now U.S. administrations have seen, it's very difficult to make headway on the North Korea issue. I think so far President Trump's approach has been kind of a mixture of increased sanctions and diplomacy, which is the right approach, because when you start getting into military options with North Korea, we're somewhat limited. I mean, we've got something like almost 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea that are ready to go. But you don't ever want it to be go time, because what lays before us is a nuclear holocaust. So you don't want that to be too far on the table. The thing, though, is what President Trump has tried so far is going via China, which is really the only option to try it first, because that's our best one, to try and encourage China to put the kind of pressure on the regime that other countries do. Mixed bag there. So far, the president's been very frustrated by it, though he has made some headway with the Chinese. He's been pretty much in constant contact with them since his first day in office.
But that's why he had that meeting with the leaders of Japan and South Korea. Because, they've obviously got so much at stake, and they want to do whatever they can to make sure we avert that kind of a crisis, because not only will it be a nuclear holocaust, but the ones who survive will create a refugee issue for South Korea that we haven't seen.
Well, Japan and South Korea's national security interests align much more organically with our own than China's.
Yes. Yes.
So that is something
and
he's
China
wise to pull on, of course.
I mean, the Trump administration tried the carrot approach with China by saying, hey, won't label you a currency manipulator and others. I think you will see the administration take another go at China, but this time with more of a stick. They sailed past the islands for a second time, those artificial islands. There's other things they can do on trade, which they're sort of chomping at the bit to do anyway, as they ran on sort of free and fair trade. So you could see some of that be triggered to kind of send a signal to China. We really, really mean this, and we're not leaving this neighborhood. We're truly aligned with Japan. We're truly aligned with South Korea and Australia. We're going nowhere. We're only building those alliances even more, and we're not going to tolerate, because as you said, Melissa, the longer we wait, it only gets worse. The last time we threatened military action for real was 1994, before North Korea even had military weapons. Okay, but imagine if we'd actually done something there.
Well, Pete, what does Russia get out of thwarting a UN sanction against North Korea for testing
thumbing the nose at the Americans, which they love to do and they will always do because they see us as a geopolitical foe. Plus, they've got this sort of unholy alliance with Iran and North Korea that they feed each other, support each other with a shared adversary of the United States.
Whoa. The problem, just quickly, is that China is never going to do exactly what the United States wants it to do, because it's got a vested interest in propping up the North Korean regime for financial reasons, if nothing else. Something like 75% of North Korea's food is imported from China. Without that business.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We are waiting for a briefing from senior administration officials. It's going to be audio only. We'll bring that to you just as soon as. Okay, it's been quite an hour. We saw both President Vladimir Putin and President Trump getting together for a meeting that took over 2 hours. Senior administration officials are going to come out and have a briefing in not too long about what exactly went on behind closed doors. Pete, your final thoughts on everything we've seen this hour.
First of all, it's always delightful to spend an hour with the Lord.
Oh, thanks, Dad.
Flattery will get you anywhere.
Welcome to Trump's America. No, I think what we're seeing happen is America First foreign policy on display. By taking care of ourselves, we take care of the free world. It almost feels like, in a Teddy Rooseveltian way, he's heading to Europe to remind them of what they used to be. You know, honor God, not godlessness. They honor freedom, not bureaucracy. Patriotism, not citizens of the world. Alliances, not international agreements that bind us. Have more babies. Demographics matter, as opposed to all these things. Strength versus weakness. He's reminding them of what they used to be and calling them to that. And it's a direct contrast.
It's also a revival of American exceptionalism, which was out the window for a very long time and almost became a dirty concept under the Obama administration. I'm sure as hell happy to see it make a big comeback.
Yeah, very true. Like we were ashamed of who we were. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not ashamed of you.
I was never ashamed of who we were.
Okay. All right. We'll be right back.